So I created practice. You're good. And we do build brands at a larger scale. So this image here, for example, is a brand that we launched, and we created every single package you see in that store across multiple stores at launch. I also work on consulting with existing brands to help them reduce their impact and think about exactly how they can practice ethical commerce at the scales that they are. Something I love is that at that scale, the little changes you make actually make really big differences. And over the years of my career, I mandated sustainability research about 7 years ago, after realizing that I needed to think more thoughtfully about what I was making. Had a project go really well and then felt really bad about it, actually. And created Waste Not. So over all those years of research, I had built this really large compendium of sustainable packaging resources, and Waste Not is a free open source searchable list of sustainable suppliers. I created all the criteria based off of all these years of research and education I had to make sure that everything on there has a really thoughtful level of impact. And all of that is just kind of laddering up to someone, as I think we all are, trying to earn a living, also trying to create jobs, but also be really mindful of how I'm doing that and what I'm doing and how it impacts others and hopefully the world.
Thanks, Michelle. So I'm Brian Schmatz. I like Michelle picked this good background here of like very classic chemistry. I know I was introduced as a chemist. In today's world, it'd be very common for me to come up here and be like, the modern chemist is nothing like this. But this was my life for a good 5 years. I'm an organic chemist, did my PhD at Georgia Tech. And this was what my life looked like. This was my fume hood, worked on materials for electronic and optical applications, which I can talk a little bit more about. But basically materials that were designed to interact with light in different ways. So they tended to look very nice and beautiful. So I really loved working on this stuff. What we were working towards was a field called printable electronics. The idea is that we were making materials that, similar to like an inkjet printer of printing some sort of logo or something, you can print actual functional electronics. So things like LEDs, things like solar cells, and these here are color changing materials. So they're called electrochromics. They go from highly colored to clear. If you've ever gone in a Boeing Dreamliner, they use them for the windows to go between a dark blue to a clear. So really cool technology that's seeing some market adaptation. My work was all in this field. How do we move inks from printing from very hazardous solvents to waterborne inks, which are much more sustainable? It's a thing that most of like printer inks have moved to, but this field being very new, people weren't really thinking along those lines. So this is really where I got started with the idea of like needing, from a chemistry standpoint, to design around sustainability from the get-go before something takes off and it's like too out of control to actually reel back in. From there, I moved from a PhD to working at the world's largest chemical company. So it's called BASF. I worked in our cosmetics pigments division, so I made sparkle. I'm happy to debrief after the talk about the differences between sparkle and glitter, but we worked on sparkle mostly and put them into eyeshadows, lip balms, etc., to get a good idea of how they performed. This here is a special shot to me. I started a project while I was in this group on a plant-based glitter. So this one was glitter. Most glitter is plastic-based and tiny bits of it really not good. So this is a micrograph picture of what I had made. Really cool material. It actually changed color depending if you put it in like water versus a shampoo. So very fun to play with. That side of our business got sold and patented with it. So who knows where it is these days, but was also kind of how I got started on the industrial side, working around sustainability. Nowadays, I work with a part of our company called Trinamics. So we make this little instrument here, which I can talk a bit about more in our talk. It's called a handheld spectrometer, very common quality control tool, but usually you see them as like big boxes. So our whole business is miniaturizing them and kind of democratizing the solution. One of the biggest use cases is plastics identification. So this is where I really started my journey with recycling. I'm a PhD in polymer chemistry, but I knew nothing about recycling until I dove into this realm. So it really shows that like even experts in plastics don't always know where our plastics end up. So this is really where I got involved in this space. And what we do in the plastics realm is scan a piece of plastic and tell you what it's made out of so you can sort it for recycling. So I sell mostly to like recyclers and manufacturers, but I also really love to work around creating circular systems. And so because our parent company is such a huge global conglomerate, I try to find ways to leverage that. So this is actually from a recent project we did this last May in Seattle. With a group called Net Your Problem. They work with local fishermen to take end-of-life nets and find recycled homes for them. So we've been working with them for a bit because they use our technology to sort the nets. I was able to introduce them to our colleagues at BASF who can actually take those nets and bring them into new materials like footwear and furniture. And so we had an event throughout the Puget Sound at 3 ports, collected about 20,000 pounds of nets in that time. And most of them are nylons that our company has now taken into their fold to bring into new materials. So really kind of fun way to go from just selling to recyclers to actually seeing like big vision projects, which has been really fun. So that's a little bit about myself. Jumping into the topic now. Really wanted to poll the audience because I think one of the most interesting parts about sustainability is it's a very loosely defined term. So just curious, any feedback in the audience of what sustainable packaging means to you, or what would you consider a sustainable package? Any takers?
Or buzzwords that we hear also that we might relate to the category.
Yeah, so some things we hear a lot, compostable or circular, bio-based, all come up pretty often, but can be kind of nebulous terms. And knowing the difference between greenwashing or not, I see someone here in the chat put recyclable content. So that's another big one, is use of recycled materials. A lot of different things can come to be sustainable packaging, and we kind of wanted to talk about what those different facets mean today. But really distilling back to the beginning, Michelle and I were talking about like what really is a package at the base of it. And we were thinking it really comes to 2 pieces, communication and contain. So containing a physical product and communicating what it is. You can get kind of philosophical and ask, if it doesn't say what it is it considered a package? Or can you have a product that doesn't require containment but still carries a brand? Yeah, pretty deep into that, but I think we can all agree on a packaging side, these are kind of the 2 main things. But you can obviously look beyond these 2 to an actual container itself.
Yeah, and as designers, I think our baseline is that we create something that something lives in, and then we label it. And that communication part is a lot of people who have graphic design degrees, they actually have communication design degrees. So we're very used to that. But actually, when we start to think about what these things are, there's a lot more happening than we ever really expect. We have things like seals to preserve product, and we're going to talk a lot about these parts of packaging, barrier films, so things that might prevent UV rays from degradation, additives, colorants, how we get these lovely brand colors that we recognize, as well as closures like, you know, how something might spray or the user experience of a product. And before we kind of get into all of this, because as I mentioned, it can get a little heavy when we think about the impact of packaging. It's important to remember that packaging actually really helps us as a society and as people. One of the things that it does is it brings accessibility. So we're having some classic New York right now. All right. So a lot of the things that we buy in stores, we wouldn't be able to get otherwise. Maybe they're from different parts of the world. We're able to access them more, and that can be for all sorts of reasons. You know, medication is a pretty serious one that comes to mind. It extends the shelf life, and if we want to think about waste, there's a lot of things that might not be used at the right rate, but packaging preserves them, which allows for a whole another kind of consideration of waste to not be achieved. It reduces cost because we're able to do this at scale. We can actually make it more accessible and more affordable for people to gain access to these things. And probably the biggest advances we've seen as a culture are in health and safety. As much as we might villainize plastic, we probably wouldn't be where we are in modern medicine without it. And that still also goes to the food that we eat and the water that we drink, and the reason why we're all here and hopefully healthy and happy.
Yeah, so I think it's always important when you're designing to realize that sustainability is a balance. If we go back to what Michelle had mentioned here, oftentimes these 4 categories are essential to the success of a package, but can be in a push-pull relationship with the actual sustainability of a package. Good example I like to give is like buying local at a farmer's market versus getting at a grocery store. I was telling Michelle something I remember from my undergrad experience. I took an environmental art activism course, which was very strange. But our teacher was really like super into sustainability and was like, I don't even own a fridge. I go to the farmer's market every day to get fresh produce. And that's great. And that definitely lowers your personal impact, but it drastically lowers accessibility. Not everyone can do that. And that also is a pretty big pillar of sustainability, is thinking of social access, that everyone needs access to sustainable food, not just people who can afford to go on a daily basis to a farmer's market. So while it definitely feels nicer to go direct, and I'm not saying not to, if you have that option, that's definitely the more sustainable option. But the packaging does serve a purpose. It does extend the shelf life, lets it get to people who don't have a farm nearby, lets people put it in their fridge and make it a few days later if they've got a busy life. So it definitely is a push here between sustainability and accessibility, which is something to keep in mind. Another good example I like to talk about is Snapple bottles change. If you look up anything about Snapple bottles change from glass to plastics, people were like very pissed off about this and were like, they're trying to greenwash, they're not fooling anyone, glass is better. Our perception is usually glass is better, but there's more to the conversation. So moving to plastic actually drastically lowers the material and energy input to make a product, also makes it usually about half as heavy. And so it's much cheaper to ship, lower emissions to ship as well. And then, yeah, I think those are kind of the main two drivers there. That being said, if the Snapple plastic bottle ends up in the waterways, that's terrible. Whereas if the glass one does, it's really not as bad. So here you get into this push-pull between sustainability from like a life cycle analysis and carbon emission standpoint to sustainability from a circularity standpoint of, you kind of have to decide which is more important to you. It's great if you can knock both out with one stone, but typically you have to make some kind of choice of which is more important to you as a designer, as a brand. All right, and now Michelle's going to walk you through the actual use case of building these out. And this, I think, is super chock full of great information.
Well, so I love that example on Snapple because also that mixed material, right? We've got like an aluminum cap and a glass bottle. And while we think it's more sustainable, there's a lot of problems that Brian's gonna illuminate us on that actually happen at the end of its life cycle. But if we think about what it takes to create a package design, we're gonna walk you through this. First off, we have to start with the virgin material in order to understand what we're gonna design with. We enter that into the design phase. That gets manufactured, distributed. Congratulations, you've sold something, it's now consumed, collected, hopefully to the right places that person's, putting that in the right organizational to eventually get recycled. I'm going to take you through the first half of this arc and some of the things that you might need to keep in mind if you want to have a sustainable practice. So let's start with virgin materials. Some questions we have to ask ourselves at the very high level are, how is this raw material produced? Really looking at the general qualities that it has, but then there's so many heavier questions that might lead to, like, does it hurt ecosystems? Is it socially ethical? Is it a renewable resource? And what kinds of carbon emissions are created from those retrievals? So we thought something that might be the most helpful is to actually go material by material and talk about what does this actually start to look like. So let's maybe start with our most famed and potentially most disliked product on the list, plastic. Brian mentioned this, but it's extremely lightweight, which if we think about that, that's less fuel to ship. There's a lot of good reasons for that. It has a water and air barrier to it, so it does help keep us safe. And generally it's a low cost and a low material. If you were to compare the amount of plastic used to make like a plastic bag versus the amount of paper used to make a paper bag, that amount of material is considerably different. It's very, very small to make that plastic bag. And I think sometimes when we question why things are made in plastic so much, if you actually saw at the back end what that looks like in terms of material use, it's really different. Some pretty considerable cons here though. Hundreds of years to degrade if it's put into a landfill. It pollutes ecosystems and we know that. It can become microplastics. It's made from fossil fuels, so there's all sorts of problems here with emissions. When plastic decomposes, it releases greenhouse gases. So even in the right way of eventually that it might go away, there's still problems. And it may need a barrier coating for UV rays. It doesn't protect from light. Comparable to plastic or bio-based polymers, these are just plastics that are made with organic or bio-based materials. They have similar qualities. They're lightweight, they have water and air barriers, there's a low cost and a low material, but another pro is that there's more renewable resources. Things like corn are often used for this. And we reduce the carbon emissions, obviously not being made from fossil fuels. We get all the same cons as we do with regular plastic in its like end life. It's the same material. But we also have to think about that there's pollution from pesticides and fertilizer, and, you know, highly debated, but the land and food source use of this is also under question as to whether these are truly better than one another. Aluminum is very lightweight. It has a natural barrier across everything, UV rays, water, air, and it is infinitely recyclable, which I think is just a really cool thing to know about aluminum. There are certainly some cons. So aluminum is made from bauxite, and to mine bauxite, you have to drill very deep into the earth, and it permanently damages those ecosystems. They're like these big carved hollows of the earth. And that takes considerable energy use to do that. It poses human health hazards, things like releasing dust. And if it's not recycled, it doesn't degrade. But I think it's actually really important on this one to point out that if this was recycled, these all go away. So if we're looking at this being put into recycling and repurposed, and we're reusing aluminum in the way that we're not currently yet, but eventually do, all of the cons here are kind of wiped out and we just get the pros. Glass has a natural water and air barrier. It is also infinitely recyclable. Because of the weight of glass, it requires considerably more fuel and therefore creates more emissions to transit. It doesn't degrade if it's recycled. Where in New York, we could go to the Met and look at some very old, beautiful glass works that are still very much intact. They don't go away for a very long time. They often require a colorant or a barrier for UV rays. A great way to think of this is that there's a reason why most of like beer and bottle packaging is in an amber colored glass that helps protect from those refrigeration UV lights as well as the sun. The closures are often mixed materials. You can't really thread a cap, a glass on glass. So you're looking at mixing that with plastic, with aluminum. There's a reason why our wine bottles usually have corks in them, for example. And actually glass is not renewable at its current rate. And this is something I don't feel like I would love to get feedback on this that most people know, but sand mining has tripled in the last 2 decades. And it does damage ecosystems when they do it. So they're essentially taking sand away from an ecosystem that can change the current, that can bring out sediment, that can do all sorts of things. But currently sand is consumed faster than our natural geological processes. Paper and cardboard, very, very lightweight, degrades very easily. It's low in greenhouse emissions. And a really interesting thing I think about paper and tree farming is that these young trees, in the process of creating young forests consistently, they sequester carbon dioxide. So they have a kind of planetary benefit. It does have a very poor barrier property. So if you've ever had like food packaging in a paper pouch, very likely that has a plastic or a foil lining inside because that's not protecting from moisture and air. There's also deforestation, obviously, is a big concern here. And there's very high water usage here, both for virgin and recycled. When we recycled paper, there's a lot of water used. The best advice I can give here is that there's actually some really great things happening in this category, but just know your companies and do the research on the companies you're working with. There's some that are so committed to making sure that they are working with renewable rates and how their practices are, you know, complying to make sure that we're all protected. And there's some that are more akin to the deforestation concern here. So just know who you're working with. Industrially composted materials, probably the most familiar version of this we all know is if you ever have gotten like a takeaway coffee, iced coffee, and it's in a clear cup that says I'm compostable, and maybe it has a straw that says the same on the label. So these are made of bio-based materials. They are low impact when composted. Industrial compost, for those, I don't know if everyone knows this or not, is essentially heated up to pretty high degrees, like a big oven, for a long period of time, like weeks. And when it's industrially composted, it helps feed that circular economy, which is great. There is a problem though. So let's say you're in Times Square and you get your iced coffee and you're walking with your friend and you drop that in a New York City trash can. It's the same as plastic. So it's still going to take hundreds of years to degrade. These require certification for correct use to make sure that in that industrial compost, they're effective, that they're not releasing anything that's harmful. And then we still deal with some of these things that we have with using bio-based ingredients like pesticide and fertilizer pollution or land and food source use. But probably most interesting is that we live in a city here where we probably have some of the most access, the brown bin program, all of that, but I'm not sure that everyone would maybe feel that you have a lot of access to industrial compost. So right now, in the way that the world is, this is very limited or almost no access to most citizens. Curbside compostable materials are brand new. They're great. They're very interesting. It's very hard to talk about this category generally because it is so new, but typically they're very bio-based. They help feed the circular economy. You could put this in your backyard compost. But it's such a new field and there's limited options. In general, there's low participation with home composting, but would definitely encourage we're excited to see what happens in this space and leveraging it when you find it. It's just very limited right now. And a lot of these companies, as we heard about Brian working on glitter and sparkle, it takes a lot of research and a lot of R&D to get there. So hopefully we'll see more and more come. Oh, someone asked here, what is the circular economy? Please explain. So we're going to get into this for sure, but something you should know is that all of these post-consumer materials that we have, they have price points. So if we go back to glass, or actually let's think about plastic. Clear plastic is much more valuable because if we recycle different colors plastic, so there's a green Sprite bottle in there, that plastic, that raw material that they buy back then to use as post-consumer waste will have like a gray tinge to it, and those companies don't want that. So there's a certain economy to these materials when recycled and resold. And we want to feed that economy, right? Like we want people to be buying back the waste. But it's interesting to remember that it is a business and we're definitely going to get into that. But as a great example, clear glass and clear plastic are much more valuable because otherwise they have to sort through those colors and there's another process that goes through in that recyclability. And inks. So inks can be applied in two ways. Designers in the room would probably know like screen printing or, offset printing. They also can be used as pigment. So kind of inserted into the plastic. If we look at this example, this is inks and pigment in the plastic. One of the best things I think here is that it helps deliver essential communication, like how to recycle it and what to do with it, or really helping people guided to what they need to do. And it's typically a really low volume for application. You don't need a lot of this to achieve it. I just brought this up, but pigments disrupt recyclability. So in general, like we know, clear plastics are much more valuable than colored plastics. So they do often disrupt these like end processes. All right. So once we've looked at our virgin materials, and I think that's a pretty holistic view of what's available right now, I would be happy to answer to any others. We're going to move into design. And there are these 5 like pretty, I would say like well-realized principles in the industry around sustainable design. We have one more that we use at practice because we work with pre-revenue brands. But the first is reuse. So as much as we can, we want to reduce single-use packaging. Think if it can be repurposed or how that might work. We want to reduce that material, that shipment size, the weight. That's a great principle and way to remember some of the things that have already come up. Renew, make sure it's from bio-based materials and that we can, replete those sources. Recycling, feeding that circular economy or the compost economy. Redesign wherever we can, find greater efficiency. And roadmap. So we often work with clients that are early stage. They haven't launched yet, which means they're not just pre-launch, they're pre-revenue. At this point, they haven't made any money. They're not making any money. So we have to do the best we can by, whatever limitations we have, But it's very important that we set that roadmap for, okay, when you hit scale, this is the actual goal, or here's the benchmark too. And what you'll see a lot in packaging are this term minimums, but a lot of companies won't want to work at underneath 10,000 units to 30,000 units. So let's say injection molding, making custom shape, that usually starts at 30,000 units, and not everyone's ready to purchase that much upfront. So you might help roadmap them, okay, we have to use this off the shelf package. But once we have to place an order that's near 30,000 units, we will buy the mold and use post-consumer plastics or a bio-based material would be an example. And there's some questions we ask up front, things like, and we're going to get into these, is it compact by design? How will it be labeled? Are these materials mixed? Does it preserve the contents? Those are all on that contain side of me and Brian being like, what is a package design? And then communicate, our customers clearly understanding how to dispose of the product. So let's talk about, is it compact by design? This is an example that we actually just went through at practice in the last 2 months. So our client loved this package on the right. It was a skincare brand. This is like a paperboard tube, and when you open it, it's really beautiful. It has that kind of suction that you get from, if you've ever unboxed an Apple product, that we all really find satisfying, and it sits on this kind of podium and presents the bottle inside very beautifully. If we look at that unbranded, and then we look at maybe, you know, a paper box that folds flat, that will always have the same footprint. It cannot change, and it has to be shipped at that size, and it moves from, you know, when it's created to when it's printed to the customer at that size. Whereas this box here, this is a very successful skincare brand. They both are, but this one is really doing numbers right now, which is great to help convince your clients to give them a benchmark. But this package goes flat, and we can fit 30 in the same place as that one on the right. So we were able to kind of convince them that maybe that's not the right option. And thinking about that compact nature. You can also do this by, you know, how much surface area a design takes, and thinking about that. Something to know as packaging designers. Maybe some people here work on direct to consumer products, so this isn't as important because your website is kind of like your billboard or your agency or the way that you're selling it. If your product is sold in retail, that's kind of your advertising. So that principal display panel, that front of that package, is how people see and recognize your brand. So it's actually, a lot of clients are going to push for bigger packages than we need. We often see this. You might see that there's like an insert or something that's making it larger than it is. That's pretty much advertising and marketing that you're dealing with. And there's ways you can go about that. You can make a package wider but thinner, and it could have less volume. We actually were just talking about this in a meeting recently. But as an example, you might have gone into the beverage aisle and been like, wow, that's a lot of flavors of kombucha. And it's not necessarily that those brands are like, wow, our customers aren't happy, we need to make more flavors. They're just trying to increase the size of their shelf space and therefore their brand visibility and their advertising. So this is something to really think about when you're working in a retail environment. How will it be labeled? Visual learner here, so maybe the best way to say is, let's take a look at this can. This is an aluminum can. It's shrink wrapped with a plastic label. Brian's going to demonstrate this later, but our recycling processes use light to say like, oh, what is this material? And then they get sorted. So this would get sorted as plastic. So we want as much as we can. And I think this is one of the best terms, like single stream. We want non-mixed materials because that's going to allow everything that we design to be more efficiently recycled. Doesn't always mean that's the most sustainable. Like there are other solutions, but as a benchmark, that's actually a really great way to think about how to make your packaging more efficient. Or this example on the right, this set has this kind of plastic shell. It's got this cardboard interior and this plastic handle, probably PVC. These are 3 different materials. So if someone doesn't separate these, this is just going to landfill. And sure, that plastic outer might be recyclable. Yes, that paper inside is recyclable, but as a unit, it is not. Which brings us to, are people clearly instructed of how to dispose of it? This Lysol bottle, in order to make sure this doesn't go to landfill, a few things have to happen. You have to remove this pump and take the spring out because that's metal. And then this label here is a different type of plastic than that hard inner shell. So when that goes through recycling and that gets tracked as the wrong kind of plastic, that goes to a different sort, and then that eventually goes to landfill because it's not the right plastic that it's been sorted to. So as designers, I think this is one of the easiest things. Like we have a seat at this table. We don't have to get to the very top, but we can just communicate really effectively how to properly dispose of something. But if we don't, then we'll have a lot of products that might seemingly look recyclable end up in landfill because they're not clearly able to understand. And I'm sure all of us, if we might have bought this, might have made this mistake and would have loved to know what we could have done better.
Question. Does that have stickers also, or is it just that plastic wrap?
Yes,
Stickers as
yeah.
well?
So let's say that's a total paper sticker. That might be detected as paper. And then does it preserve its contents? I think we often underlook this. This might come from like the science side of the things that we're creating, especially if we're working in food packaging. But we went through this example, but light and UV rays, if we don't want to degrade, like have the alcohol degrade in beer packaging, for example, so we need to make sure it's protected. There's a reason why a lot of our food is shrink wrapped in this way, especially raw food, to prevent bacteria, moisture. This happens a lot in skincare. If you think about like you're using an acne product, you don't want bacteria entering that product. But I also would think of like a surgeon washing their hands before surgery. You would want them to be using something that's totally sterile. And the way that that's dispensed is often very much thought about from a packaging perspective. And then damage, because we don't want to deliver damaged things. And if you've ever wondered why there's cotton in your pill containers, that's why. It's to prevent those pills from being damaged. And this is extremely important because if we get this wrong, we can face recalls, we can face degradation, we can face short-term shelf life, and that's much more wasteful than any other packaging decision we can make. These are pretty horrifying when they happen, and they do happen quite frequently. All right, so we're going to talk about this next part together because they're kind of combined, and I'll get into that. But next, so we've got our design, we're ready to go, we're going to manufacture it, and then ultimately distribute it. There's some questions we want to ask ourselves, like, does it have to be co-packed? Not everyone knows what this word means, but that's the idea that, sometimes the product is made somewhere and the box is made somewhere else, and they all kind of have to meet somewhere and be put together. Where are they all made? If we're thinking about that, can they be produced locally to each other? Are they ethically made? And what is the shipping method to distribute these? So this is a hard thing to break down. So I thought maybe let's all kind of think about this package and I didn't work on this, but let's just go into like a hypothetical situation. How might have this been made? And I think this to me looks like a pretty thoughtful, someone tried to be sustainable on this package. Not saying that it isn't, but it's interesting to think about what might go into what we deem as a sustainable package. So this is some kind of oil that's packaged in a dropper bottle. That's a glass bottle with some bamboo on the applicator. It's in this mycelium tray, which is made from mushrooms and home compostable, one of these new materials that are very exciting. And it's put into a cardboard box. And we often think about the impact of this as like, it's shipped to the consumer and then they are recycling it or disposing of it. But actually, before that ever happens, a lot of things have to happen first. So with that mycelium, we can kind of imagine that this company Evocative is producing those mushrooms in-house. They're compressing them, they're drying them, and then they're shipping that product in that tray to the co-packer. This serum bottle has to be produced. This could actually, when I was hypothesizing, be like 5 more steps, because actually in many instances when we work on packaging, this top is made somewhere else. Every year we go to LuxPack, and this last year we talked to a company that only makes caps, and that's actually pretty common. So let's just say that it was all produced in one place. That glass packaging and all of that has to be produced. That's then shipped. It's then labeled, let's say, screen printing. There are a few new companies coming out. They're actually mostly in Canada from what I've noticed, but that actually do the cosmetic formulation and the packaging and labeling all in one. But typically you're gonna go send that, that's gonna get screen printed or labeled. That then gets shipped to the chemist or whoever has been working on this oil to get filled. And then that goes to the facility that is going to co-pack those all together. And then lastly, this box, we have to produce that from paper pulp. That just gets printed and cut to shape, and then that gets shipped to the co-packer. And then we get to that place that we think about, oh, let's ship that to the customer and then they'll dispose of it. But it's not just about how it's shipped to the customer. So if we think about how that glass bottle might have traveled, that had to be safe and secure during all of those shipments. So there's actually a lot of waste produced in the stream before you ever even get it into a customer's hand. We don't work with glass actually that often because of this. It's typically styrofoam. There's a lot that's produced. I think it's pretty incredible as designers to think about when we do work on these things, you know, there's these big cargo containers crossing oceans of what we've made, and they need to be safe. So that's certainly something to consider. And the heavier the contents, the heavier the impact. So I don't know why I keep bringing up beer today, but we're going to keep going there. Let's take beer, for example, in a can. That green is the contents, so it's the same fill. But that weight of the package is considerably different between an aluminum can and a glass bottle. And now we can also imagine how that glass bottle might have been shipped to the facilities in order to be filled. And talking of shipping, that impact is pretty profound. So this is an example of Hong Kong to London. The carbon and everything that's created in that process is really considerable if you air freight something. This air freight from Hong Kong to London is about 10 hours. This is 13 days. So the best way you can get ahead of this is to be ahead of your timelines. And it can be really challenging. It's important to keep in mind, but air freight is 47 times more damaging in terms of carbon offset than by sea or by freight. All right. So again, congratulations. We've created a product. Now someone's purchased it. The way that our society works now, and this is changing, and there's some legislation we're really excited about, is that this is now the consumer's problem. It's not the company's problem anymore. But the way we work in right now, they then consume it, they put it for collection, and hopefully it ultimately ends up in recycling.
So, thanks, Michelle. Can you go back for a second, because I know someone did ask before, what is circular economy, which is a good question. So if we think of the standard process of someone consumes it and then just throws it in the trash or throws it out the window, that's a linear economy. So you've made it, you've used it, you put it to waste. Circular is bringing that waste back in. That can be recycling, that can be reuse methods, but in some way getting it back into the loop. And that's kind of the loop that defines the circular economy. It's become, I would say, a catch-all term for like any reduction of waste in processes. But the general idea is cutting out waste so that you can reuse all of the inputs again and again. So this is where I've been heavily involved on the circular economy side and recycling. I've been working closely with recyclers in North and South America for the past 4 years. And I will say it's a very complex beast, but the more I've engaged with it, the more excited I am about it. I hear all the time and probably see 2 articles per day that say recycling doesn't work, please stop doing it. Very disheartening to me because I see the people who make it work. It does deserve to be challenged, but I wouldn't throw it out the window because it is a system that does actually work for plastics and other materials as well. So I'm going to talk about plastics. This same loop is pretty similar if you go to metals or to paper as well. But since I work mostly in the plastic space, I want to talk to this. So generally, when you are buying something that is made from virgin materials, so someone is taking a fossil fuel input, chemists like me will put this in a giant steam cracker, make monomers, make polymers, and these are the materials that you then have as plastics. So these get sent to converters and CPG, consumer packaged good brands. They sell it to us. We throw it in the blue bin, hopefully, to get recycled. A collection company, oftentimes they're supported by municipalities. So our tax money does go into making the system work. So you'll find much more collection infrastructure in places that support recycling from the legislative side than other places in the US especially. These will then go to a materials recovery facility, it's called. People call it MRF in the industry. These are spaces that take all of this mixed material and separate them all out into separate inputs. So plastics one place, glass another, cardboard another. And those materials then get sent to recyclers or reclaimers, they'll be called, who then process that into new material that they can then sell back into as a replacement for virgin pellets. So if we dive deeper into this materials recovery facility, because this is really where all of the magic happens in recycling, I would say, it gets very, very complex. These images here are actually not too far from us. So Sunset Park in Brooklyn has the most advanced MRF in the country. So very, very, very high tech. They process all the recycling for all 5 boroughs. Basically, if you go here and they do tours, so I welcome you going and taking a tour. It's really interesting. You will see barges coming in nonstop and cranes taking all of this plastic and other waste off of these barges. There's trucks coming in from Brooklyn and Queens, but everything is centralized in here. And then those get put onto belts to then go through this whole process of separation. So I'll walk you through that because it's really important to know how our recycling infrastructure works to be able to design around it. So the first step is a 2D versus 3D sort. This is mostly looking to get cardboard and paper out from everything else. A good watch out here is flat materials that aren't paper can get stuck in this process. So if you think Amazon mailers or bags that you get from grocery stores, they usually say recyclable, but at a separate location, like please bring me to an Amazon store to get picked up. The reason is they get clogged up in that 2D sort. And so recyclers hate to see those materials because it just jams the system and they're really difficult to collect. So that's why those are segmented out. The next step is magnet and what's called eddy currents. So this is looking for 2 types of metals, ferrous and non-ferrous, so aluminums versus things like steel. So this is really just a giant magnet will pull the metals off and an eddy current kind of flows things off into another belt. This is a good example. I know Michelle alluded to it when I mentioned the Snapple bottle. A big design flop that I hear about in the recycling space when Snapple changed to the plastic bottle, they wanted to keep their iconic metal snap. It was a big part of their brand. The issue was because the light weight of the plastic was so different than the glass. When this went under the magnet and eddy current, it got the whole bottle will pull with it. And so by making that switch, you now miss that plastic and now you're gumming up your metals recycling because it's pulling that with it. So you'll actually see very, very modern Snapple bottles have just done away with the metal cap completely to a plastic cap. Pretty interesting example because they got rid of a pretty core piece of their brand to actually address this issue, which is nice to see. The next piece is impact. So everything just falls down onto some graters and smashes. So all of the glass falls through cracks. This is why small plastics are particularly bad for recycling. So if you recycle a bottle with a cap, it's always best to keep the cap on because caps, delivery spoons and sporks and things like that will all fall through these cracks and get missed. So typically small items need to be kept together with the bottle to make it through to the next step. And the final is optical sort. So I like to say they've got like $1 million version of one of our devices here. This is where all the plastics go under and are characterized for what plastic type they are and then kicked into separate bins. So it gets much more complex on each one of these stages. I'll just go into the plastic one. After this, you segment plastic. Typically, they're looking for PET and high density polyethylene, number 1 and number 2. These are by far the most recycled plastics in the world. Polypropylene is up and coming. Not a lot of places have capabilities for this. And then low density polyethylene, which is like the Amazon mailers, are also up and coming, but typically exist separate. Pretty much most places will take the number 1 and number 2 and dump everything else into like an other bin that just hits the open market for anyone willing to take their chances with it. If we follow each one of these streams, they go to a separate recycler. So there's hundreds of PET recyclers only and hundreds of HDPE recyclers only, and they do further processing steps. So they'll take the label off of everything with like an intense wash. They do a color sort, like Michelle mentioned before, you need to get green bottles away from clear because the clear is high value. Anything colored just becomes kind of a mixed stream. They then chop this up and granulate it, do what's called a float sink. So certain plastics float in some sinks, so it's a way to get final contaminants out. And then you've got your post-consumer recycled material. So you can see it's very complex. And I know everything Michelle and I have been saying is like very overwhelming. I think what's nice to know if you're doing sustainable design is you can't do everything. And so finding particular spots can have a really big impact if you just kind of focus in on something. So finding one of these areas where something can go wrong with your package and innovating around it can have a much bigger impact than trying to revolutionize the whole system and maybe not getting off the ground with that. So one area I want to specifically talk about is black plastics. So in the optical sort stage, a huge issue that not a lot of people know about, but people in the industry know about, is black plastics are typically not recycled because they can't be seen by sorting systems that are currently used. And I'll give a demo of that with ours in a bit. But the way I like to put it is these sorters work very similar to our eyes. So our eyes can perceive colors and we use those colors to make a decision. So if you go to the grocery store, you look at some bananas, you pick the yellow ones because you know that those are ripe, and we use that color to do that determination. So the example I give here, if you look at this chip here, pretty clearly says, I'm polyethylene, screaming it out to us. If you go to this graph here, so this is data that a near infrared sorter will see. This is the data from this red chip here. Basically, to this machine, this is also screaming, hey, I'm polyethylene. Now, if you look at this black chip here, this writing is still here, but because of the non-existent contrast, you can't see that writing anymore. It's black on black. And the same issue is really happening in the near infrared as well. So certain black pigments will just absorb all light. And so what's happening here is this data is still underneath there screaming like, hey, I'm polyethylene, recycle me. But up top, it's just getting swarmed by this like, I am a black pigment, that's all you're gonna see. That being said, we can take a similar concept of, say, just using white ink on this black instead so you can read it. And we can use a different kind of black pigment that doesn't have this issue. So this is an example here, the one in the middle of a dye-based black, they're called. The one on the top is carbon black. Carbon black is probably 3 times cheaper of a pigment to use, so it's very universally used. But you can easily get around this issue with pigment choice. So this one here, you can still see has that same looking signature. So it clearly is saying I'm polyethylene and isn't being buried like the other one is. So this is an area I've been very active around. I am a board member on the Association of Plastics Recyclers, and this topic came up from Unilever because they came under fire because they have Axe brand, Tresemme, things that are iconically black bottles. And really needed to know, like, this is a pun intended, like black and white issue here. You can clearly see the two differences. But if you're a designer, the question was like, how do I know when it's good and when it's bad? And so we did a study with our device, but also at a bunch of different MRFs to figure out when black is too black to make it through, and came up with a method that designers are now using our device to quickly test things in-house to see is it or is it not amenable with our current system. So I can give, and sorry, today I learned that our app is not available in Mac OS, just iOS. So hard for people on the line to see, but our device here basically will scan a plastic. I can scan the top of this bottle and we can do some demos later. It's going to be hard to see, but it says polyethylene, high density polyethylene. If I were to go to like this black Samsung charger, this is highly loaded with carbon black. If I scan this, it will give me an error. Here it says irregular spectral shape. But if I go to this is a black plastic designed kind of like that second one I showed you there with a dye-based pigment. And this one, if I scan here, it now reads as high density polyethylene here. So we made kind of a what's called a snap test app on here. That's just a binary yes or no. It calls up this Association of Plastic Recyclers approved protocol. So designers don't need to know any of this information. They just scan something and it tells them yes or no, it passes. We're currently writing a new standard for highly packaged. So great question earlier about like big stickers. So any label can get in the way. Shrink sleeves just tend to be high coverage. What's been found in the industry is if you cover like 50% of your bottle with a label, it's fine and won't get in the way. But if you cover all of it, it can be a problem. So this is another area we're coming out with a protocol for designers, should be approved by the end of the year. But these are good examples I use. These are just test labels from a label company I work with. Very exact same design. This one has a white matte backing and kind of makes the colors pop. And this one is a clear backing. If I scan, and both of these are polypropylene labels on a polyethylene bottle. If I scan this one, it will read as polyethylene, so the label doesn't get in the way. If I scan this one, it reads as polypropylene, so it's reading the label and not the bottle. So what will happen is this one will get missorted and basically not get captured, and this one will get sorted. But same with the black plastics, the packaging designers who are doing this work don't know when is good and when is bad. So we help to write protocols to help them kind of figure out that piece there. So I like to bring up these examples because it's not something that's like, we're still using plastic, we're still using fossil fuels. But if we can change people's ways to use black plastics that can be captured, people can use labels that aren't problematic. We can get a lot more of these materials, and just that little change can impact like millions of pounds of materials being collected instead of going to a landfill. So just a nice example of like really centering in a small piece of knowing the infrastructure and saying, I want to solve this like one problem, can have a really big impact. All right, so now that I mentioned things on like a very sciencey side of when we come up with protocols, I want to pass it to Michelle of things you might find when you actually try to push those protocols through at a company.
So I mentioned this before, but minimums are a really big one. Typically when we talk about these kinds of packages, you need to be producing at a pretty large scale to make the investment worth it. So when you're working with smaller companies, the best thing you can do is think about like single recycling streams, or really look at how something might move through the waste process before you can make actionable changes, like changing the pigment that goes into a bottle. You also might get blocked by budget. As Brian mentioned, carbon black is a third of the price of these other black inks. Compliance is a big one. We need to make sure that these products are safe for human health. So while there might be more sustainable options, if that means that you're potentially compromising a product, that will block you absolutely, as it should. As I mentioned, timelines, a lot of the right things to do here take a lot of time. And the best thing you can do is get ahead of it. So we mandate all sustainability research for any new client at practice. And you would think that we might do that when we start a packaging project, but it's one of the first things we get to work on. So as we're maybe developing a brand's name or messaging or logo, we're doing this work because of how long it can take. And last but not least, leadership. It's really nice that you're all here, and I would imagine you all care about this, but not everyone does. And it does take time and effort to get through to people. Even on our small team, we're talking about, we filter our clients. They have to sign up and be willing to work with us, pay for sustainability research. We have a pretty hard filter there, but even so, we think sometimes that they could do better. And we're working through how can we educate them upfront so that they can make the right decisions. And maybe perhaps that's one of the best ways we can get through, but at the end of the day, speak up for what you believe in, or even demand of the brands that you use and say, hey, I love your product, but there's something that I don't agree with. And there are definitely some harsh realities here, which is that, while Brian mentioned, like, we don't want to hear that recycling's broken, because we need to fix it. And there's a lot of people working hard. Only about 5 to 6% of US plastic gets recycled. Around 36% of that, sorry, is made for packaging. Some other things are made for things like home. But 36% of that plastic is just solely for packaging. And about 85% of it ends up in a waste or landfills. There's a differential between this number and that has to do with incineration and also, ocean contamination, things like that. So we're gonna get this a little more positive from here.
Yes, yeah. So I know we talked about the difficulties, but want to talk about the general trends we're seeing legislatively and with consumers moving towards sustainable innovation. So as a starting point, I think a good example of what the status quo has been for probably the past 20 years is sustainability at a premium. And so yes, we'll make sustainable products for that target market that wants it, but you're going to pay sometimes double for it. So this is a good example if you wanted to use compostable trash bags instead of regular plastic trash bags, you're going to pay double for it, but they're happy to sell it to you for that. The issue is the accessibility we mentioned before. We want something to be mass market for it to actually have an impact. It can't be gate kept to just people who can afford to be more sustainable. And so what we are seeing is, I would say, sustainability is like trendy with companies now. It's become a metric to actually compete on. And when you compete with other companies, you make lofty goals and targets. So every company out there has a sustainability report with many targets that they will say are auditable. So they're definitely going to do them. They're not definitely need to do them. Their investors aren't going to pull out because they don't reach it. That being said, they do set these goals. And that is because of a lot of consumer pressure and that they want to be seen as sustainable brands. So a important one in the packaging space is, I would say, every major consumer packaged goods company has some sort of goal of using post-consumer recycled material or making sure their package is fully recyclable, usually by 2025 or 2030 or something like that. What we found, or a report found last year, is if you take the top 35 companies' goals and put them all together, there is much more demand for recycled material than there is capacity. So that's what this chart is showing here. You need a lot more PET to be recycled to marry this green bar to the orange bar or the red bar. We're actually good on polyethylene, so that's fine, but not low density and not polypropylene. Both of these we're pretty much capturing none of, but there is demand for it in the market. So that being said, even you can look at this and say, okay, they're creating unrealistic goals. What else is new? But as someone who works very upstream, I mean, I'm in a chemical company. Oftentimes, these customers are like our customers. We see this change upstream. And so these kinds of goals and targets, really, I would say, probably there's a CEO, there's some C-suite person who's got this as their like goal and target to get a bonus. And so they want to make it happen. So they push their R&D teams, who then push their suppliers' R&D teams, who then push their suppliers' R&D teams. That comes to us. So this is something we do see. I would say trends and goals at a brand level really have a domino effect. Yes.
I just wanted to share an insight about this.
Yeah.
If you don't mind.
Please.
One of Index's partners is a sustainability consultancy called Seaborn. And we ran a test with 2 sets of marketing creative for a consumer packaged good brand. That one of the ad sets mentioned sustainability in the marketing materials and the other ad set did not. And the ad set that mentioned sustainability performed like way outperformed the one that didn't. In demographics like 25 to 50. And so, I mean, when you're talking about this progression of pressure, like consumer power is such a powerful origination, and putting more and more statistics behind that is super, super interesting, I think. So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Ellie.
The way that you're thinking about this river of influence.
Yeah, definitely. We want to talk about influence here because I think it's important to know that our voices do matter, and brands, selfishly, even if it is, are listening to capture more of your money. So if you push them that way, they can be pushed and they will push that innovation upstream. And I can really attest to it. I mean, BASF as a company sells into like every single industry, but where we see the biggest sustainability innovation in our own company is in our personal care division, because our customers there are close to customers who want that. Whereas if we go to like our like industrial lubricants section, like no one cares if your like oil rig is like lubed up with something more sustainable. They should, to be honest, but they're not. And so you're not seeing that pressure. So we really see it in consumer segments. That's where we put a lot of our innovation dollars. As a chemist, if I try to propose something brand new, it has a very low chance of getting off the ground unless there's a customer specifically asking for it. Otherwise, we end up risking like doing a lot of R&D and then someone says like, too expensive, so I'm not interested. So we tend to not go down those roads. These are good examples. Michelle just took this picture the other night of brands that are adapting. So you'll see Coca-Cola moving towards more plant-based bottles. And what's nice here is you'll see all of these companies are starting to use clear containers. So Sprite did move from green to clear. And this is one that, there's no legislation saying they need to do that. They just understand that's more beneficial for recycling and more makes the final material more valuable. So going into some other levers of influence in this space, consumer pressure can influence brands directly, but they can also manifest into what I like to call like unofficial regulatory bodies. So mixtures of NGOs, trade organizations can come together to make things happen. A good example here is this How to Recycle label. This came on the market about 10 years ago. It is funded by Greenblue, which is William McDonough's company. He invented the like cradle to cradle ideology for design. So they really push this demonstration of how you recycle. We all know the chasing arrows in the like 1 through 7, but it was understood that doesn't really tell people how they should recycle it at home. So they really started this more grassroots movement to get this labeling system in place to actually tell you what parts of it are recyclable and how you can recycle it. And this wasn't legislated. They just pushed it as NGOs, started getting brand memberships. Brands now pay into this system to have it. And over time, it's become something that you need to have as a major brand. No one's legislating you need to have it, but because just general pressure of other competitors are doing it and NGOs want it, we're seeing it make their way onto the bottle. And I know this is something that they're following the How to Recycle, but what's nice about this general idea, because it's not legislated, is you can, as designers, do whatever you want with this to get the like same idea. I think Michelle has some good examples to speak to that.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't gatekept, so it's wonderful that there are NGOs that are creating this, but as a designer, you can create any version of this, obviously not with the howtorecycle.info on it, but you have the same exact power, and this makes a really big difference. Also, just something to know that not a lot of people do know is that a lot of the people that make these kinds of labels, they might make something that's totally shrink wrapped like this, but you've probably experienced the kind of label where you need to remove it to access something like a safety seal. That technology is, what these companies do. So you can actually ask for anything to be perforated and they likely won't charge you for it. So you can make this easier on the customer also by instructing them, but also adding perforation to a label if you have to work with one. And that could be a really easy sell into leadership because they don't have to pay more for it.
Thanks, Michelle. So a good example of how these unofficial regulatory bodies can impact change, aside from putting the labels on there, they can also impact brands from other ways. So an example I've brought up that I've seen a lot on the market recently, this US Plastics Pact is a group that is funded by Ellen MacArthur Foundation and World Wildlife Foundation, both pretty big environmental organizations. They came out with this basically membership-based organization that's looking to eliminate plastic waste as much as possible. There's probably a dozen of these types of organizations. This one's just very well funded. They came out with this list of problematic materials that they had sort of mandated people get rid of by 2025 if they want to meet their packaging goals. This included things like black plastics that can't be sorted, highly labeled plastics that can't be sorted, small utensils, other problematic pigments. So they came out with this list. And again, it's not something that's been regulated or legislated, but because they've started pushing this on How to Recycle, How to Recycle now is actually removing their you can't use our logo on certain big brands packages because they're not complying with this list of 10 materials. So this is an interesting way that shows how NGOs kind of can come together and put pressure on another unofficial body to then have pressure on brands, because now brands are all bought into How to Recycle, that the threat to remove that from them is now a new lever that can be pressured. So really interesting to show outside of legislation, how consumer pressure can still actually get us towards more sustainable packaging. All that being said, one more slide there. Last driver to mention is the trade organization for recyclers themselves. So I'm a part of this organization, but I do want to mention that they want to advocate for recycling so they can get more recycling in so they can make more money. So they have their own selfish interest. But these people this trade organization has the voice of all of the major brands. So these are some of their what they call graduates from their sustainable design program. And this is where I've gotten involved with them on creating a design guideline for packaging. So they will charge money to do these courses at big companies. We're hoping to democratize some of this information here, but they are a really great resource and do run these studies. So they paid for me to do these types of studies to figure out black plastics, figure out labels. So they're also a very powerful organization in this space, but it's always good to know like they really support US Plastics Pact because they want to get rid of the stuff that jams their systems. So kind of always good to understand people's drivers, but generally, if you like recycling, they're a good organization. So all that being said, things move slowly when we're waiting just for things to organically come through consumer demand and these unofficial bodies to form. Ultimately, the strongest driver comes from the regulatory side. So we're not going to see huge change until it's actually illegal not to change. And so something we wanted to leave on a more promising side, just in the past 2 years, honestly, we're starting to see EPR legislation gain some traction here in the US. So EPR is extended producer responsibility. The general idea, and it can take a lot of different forms, so it's not a catch-all term, is that producers are paying for the waste system in some way. So it's not the onus on us as a consumer, but big brands to support recycling to make sure it happens. So usually this comes with like you will get a fine to sell in our state if there isn't accessibility for 90% of the state by 2025 or something like that. And typically there's some incentives for these companies to make recycling work really well. That way they don't have to keep paying a ton into it. If they can make it as cheap as possible, but work well, that's what they're going to do. So these 6 states, just in the last like 2 years have passed EPR legislation around plastics and around plastics packaging. So this type of stuff takes time to manifest and takes time to actually become like, you can't do it things this way anymore. They usually have a grace period. But I think it's exciting to see this in the US because if we look to other parts of the world, this has been very successful. So jurisdictions around the world with EPR have reached 99% citizen access to recycling. Estimate here in the US is about 60%. So for almost half the country, you just don't even have the option to recycle. And so it really is no wonder our recycling rates are so low. But these are some nice general trends of jurisdictions. So a lot of them in Europe and then some in Canada that have put EPR through. So just some nice stats. Belgium saw a 72% increase in the recycling rate in the 10 years after passing EPR. We also have the Netherlands went from 12% to 52% in 15 years when they passed plastics EPR. Germany has been really ahead of this. So they started this in 1996 and had another packaging specific EPR pass in 2016. But from the 90s to now, they've gone from 38% to 72% for packaging material specifically, which in the US, we capture almost none of that. So really interesting to see like these systems work. And we're just starting to see the wave start in the US as well. And what's great about this is an opportunity. So something I really love about the company I work at, it's a big chemical company, so there's things to hate for sure. But we really see regulation as an opportunity. Honestly, again, it comes down to selfish interest. We have a lot of companies that are coming at us from like a commodity side. So it's cheaper to make chemicals in China than it is to Germany. But if something comes in legislation wise that says you can't use the cheapest chemical out there anymore because it's dangerous, that gives us the opportunity to use our R&D arm to be innovative and now capture new markets. So it's actually beneficial for us to see regulations come because it sparks innovation, and we know as a company that's kind of where we shine. So to me, this is very positive because as we see legislation that forces innovation, it's not just kind of a slow wave, it really pushes people to do it. So do want to jump to Michelle, who has direct experience with this type of change.
Yeah, ours works in a very different way, but we do actually see this on the brand side, even just at practice. But it's important to know that in addition to this legislation, there's more regulation around packaging and packaging design. In Australia, there's this regulation to optimize recovery and recycling of packaging. So any kind of single use, we call them consumables, has been mandated to be single stream. Which is changing a lot, and you can imagine that, and we can talk about that. But in India, their legislation is favoring recyclable substrates and materials, which is incentivizing companies. And the EU revised their packaging and waste directive and put a ban on select single-use plastics. So we're kind of used to this. We heard about like plastic bag bans and things like that on that side. We directly actually work with this one regulation, this single stream one. And I think it's really interesting to think about how design culture might shift based off of these regulations. So if we take this La Mer bag, which is a skincare brand that is very expensive, one single jar can cost $350. They need to kind of make a grandiose statement in how that gets packaged or sold in stores. So if we look at this bag, we've got gold foil, we've got this grosgrain ribbon. It looks very premium, but actually in order to recycle this, we've got metal applied to that paper. We've got a ribbon that needs to be detached. We recently launched a rebrand of Australia's French Connection, and we had to work with this regulation in order to meet this criteria, which I think is really interesting because it put us in a very neat design box. And to Brian's point that legislation and regulation drives innovation, we were able to source this handle here, which might look like a grosgrain ribbon, but it's actually made out of paper, making the whole package single stream recyclable. This isn't really being widely used. The only brand I could find that has used it after talking to the company that we worked with is COS. But we were able to achieve still a premium effect while reducing that problem of multiple stream recycling. And then we can think about, oh, are there ways that we can, let's say in fashion, for example, with French Connection, elevate brand without using devices that we're used to and maybe shift design culture. So while we might be used to gold foil as a signifier that something is more luxurious, can we achieve that through things like embossing and debossing, where we just make a single dye and no further material is used? So I think it's really exciting to think that that culture and that perspective of what is, aspirational or aesthetic might even change because of regulation. And Ellie brought this up, but also we're seeing that people want this. They want to invest in it, and it's a real driver. Harvard Business did a study on Gen Z and millennial customers as compared to older generations, and they found that they were 27% more likely to purchase when they believed that that company cared about the planet. They also were 30% more likely to spend on brands that signified transparency practices in their business, compared to 20% on different competitors. It's very likely that those brands with transparency practices are more expensive, which means that they're 10% more likely, even if there's a price differential, which is its own driver. And a great way to think about how we might be able to convince leadership if we see these things, if we have examples of Seaborn having better performing ads in order to convert customers, if we know that people are more likely to purchase, that's where consumer power and interest can really help move the needle. And yeah, thank you all. We can't really change the world without looking at it together. So we know we got into a lot of details here, but appreciate all the time that everyone spent with us here in New York and online and planet Earth. And here to answer any questions. So if there's anything that anyone wants to talk about, we're here for it. If there's things that come to mind or parts of your own practices or things at home that you're not sure how to recycle.
We didn't put in here, but maybe we can send out or something. We recommend following, if you live in New York, the recycling center's Instagram is actually super informative. And I still learn things about what you can and can't recycle from it. So recommend that. It's called SM Recycles. Yeah.
I guess it's much of a question, more like on it. I think when you guys brought up about the social issues when it comes to making sustainability more accessible to people, I feel like up until college, I didn't really learn more about also the class issues when it comes to living sustainability and how there's certain access some people have when it comes to living a much more sustainable life versus other people. And I think that bringing those topics up in this discussions around sustainability is extremely important.
Yeah, that EPR statistic is so interesting when you think about it. As New Yorkers, we don't often think, well, of course we want more recycling because we see recycling every day. That's great feedback. Thank you.
Yeah.
I was gonna ask, from the brand perspective, and as you're find sustainable options for things, have you ever found yourself in a position like advocating against like even the production of a product? Like, I feel like we're always trying to find ways to sustainably produce things, but I feel like an even bigger question is like, does this thing need to be produced? Have you ever like found yourself like in those scenarios, either actually having those conversations or like personally like trying to like tackle that bigger question?
Yeah, absolutely. One example that has come up a bit is cosmetics for children. And where that line is and what's right or what's wrong. And that's something that we've talked about as a team a few times, as well as how you advertise to children, but in just physically what products are being made, the difference between what might feel more like a lipstick and what might feel like a lip balm, and what do we think of ethically of that. On the actual like impact side of it and how that's driven, I'm trying to think of like specific examples, but certainly, I think probably the hardest space to operate in that with is fashion, because of the culture of consumption that we have. And there are people doing really interesting work there, but it's very hard to justify, I think, that our culture is correct. So we have a lot of conversations about, where does that threshold or what is the straw that breaks the camel's back? But I would say, it's probably come up for every single brand that we've worked on to push back. We had one that's interesting, and I can't talk too much about it, but it's a form of contraception. And we believe in what it does for human health, but it is a single use. And that was also an interesting ethical question. And ultimately we decided that what it provides for people from both an emotional and a physical human health standpoint was worth the value, even though it was single use.
Yeah. No, it's great to hear.
Seems like everything's about deciding the right material, not since the beginning. Do you have any advice about where to find the right manufacturers who can have those materials?
Yeah, it depends on what you're working on. It's old school, but I highly suggest going to trade fairs and talking to suppliers. We go to LuxPack every year. It's free. It's at the Javits Center. That's a really great way. I have an entire binder of business cards. Their websites are amazing, so you have to go talk to them. Unfortunately, this industry is just not really online. The closest thing we have to it is Alibaba, but there is no sustainability component. That otherwise working backwards from a material. So if you have a material in mind, you can go to a producer. But I would suggest, and this is maybe an annoying suggestion, learning about how the thing is made, and then you'll have some more insight. So if it's injection molded, for example, you'll have a better insight as to how you can manipulate the material of that. So kind of researching what your end design goal is and working backwards to what is the manufacturing process.
Do you have any I think something that I had learned about a little bit later in the game was tertiary packaging and that kind of intermediary step. And it's still something that is not brought to the designer's table a lot. It's very much like a supply chain issue. And is there any innovation that you've seen there? Any materials that feel better? Because I wasn't I don't get to see what that tertiary packaging is ever. I just know that it gets shipped in something to then get to our packers. So I just think it's really, when you showed the glass file in the styrofoam, that was kind of a light bulb moment. Is there any innovation there? I know it's a space that doesn't get seen a lot, so perhaps there's not a lot that can be done, but have you ever seen anything interesting done in that space?
Sadly, I'm going to say the answer is mostly no, and the reason is similar to the lubricant example that Brian brought up. There is no demand.
Yeah.
So the more that people or designers have a seat at the table, the more maybe we might demand that. But right now, that's all kind of invisible, and the end customer is mostly concerned about margin.
Right.
So that's where it's most important to understand the materials you work with. I can probably name the amount of glass packages we've made at practice on one hand, but we've made thousands of packages. And that's from understanding well, what are we actually doing here? What's actually happening? I will say like. And this isn't maybe the best career advice, but one of the best ways to get on top of that is to just be willing to go the extra mile and not charge for it. But saying like, hey, I would love to be in touch with the manufacturer from the start, and not allowing yourself as a designer to just be the one who submits the deliverables. And that's something I think we can start changing. But so often it's like, okay, cool, do you have the art file? But actually there's something that's happening before, and getting involved on the upfront. Even if it's a little more time, you'll just learn. I always say to our clients, like, I don't mind the emails, just keep me CC'd, and that actually can go a really long way just to have visibility on what's happening.
But I can say just before we move off that, the nice part about tertiary packaging is it's technically like post-industrial recycled material. So usually that stuff, because it's like directly from the supplier and manufacturer, they know what it is, and it tends to be easier to either like reuse exactly, or they're like, I have a deal with that bottle maker and we take all of their styrofoam and recycle that. I wouldn't say that means like, don't worry about it, it's covered, but generally like post-industrial is a little easier to handle. Post-consumers where things get really messy and becomes harder to separate, because the separation is the hard part. There are people innovating even though you can't see it. So big companies often have like supplier metrics that they need to meet. So a lot of times it's like making sure we purchase from enough like minority-owned businesses or women-owned businesses, or that we're checking sustainability profiles for all the suppliers. So I have seen things like recyclable pallets being offered and like ways to flat pack certain things. So the conversation does happen, I would say, upstream, but I think it's not to the same degree.
And I feel like the majority of innovation I see is on actually flat packing.
Yeah.
Well, people are really willing to invest quite a lot in that because of how much more they can fit in the shipment. So reducing the shipment size is probably more of where the innovation is coming than the materials or substrates around it.
Right.
Could you speak a little bit more about the manufacturers and how you can have conversations with them if you're for a particular type of innovation or package type or at a certain scale that they might not be comfortable with, or they're going to be with that concept?
Yeah. Do you mean before you've created something or with an existing product?
Either.
Either. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Do you have any experience in this?
Not so much from a like creating a package
Okay.
side, I would say. Like
Yeah.
I talk to manufacturers, but like people in their like quality control labs and stuff like that. So a little bit different.
Well, my experience is very case by case. So oftentimes what will happen is we'll have some sort of diagram, and might even look like a mood board. It's like, oh, well, we love this material and the shape, and we're looking at achieving this. We haven't designed the package, we haven't created maybe like the 3D model of it yet or anything like that. And we'll bring that to multiple manufacturers and get their opinions. It's a great way to learn because many of them love to have these conversations, but they'll tell you no for a lot of different reasons. Anything I've ever worked on that did have innovation in that space, I probably had to get like 10 no's before I got a yes. So putting that idea out there to a lot of people is probably the best advice I can get, and it's just very hit or miss. Kind of similar to like how different paper companies might operate. You might have ones that are extremely eco-conscious and some that are just, there to sell a product.
Should you be able to speak a bit more on like greenwashing and like things that you can do and say on packaging? Because I feel like some people, like there will be brands that I like before working at the company I work at now, I thought were totally sustainable, but they're like totally not. And like, I guess where is like the need of that? Is it like serves? Is it like things you can say? Is it sources you can learn about, just like things to like people help you too?
Yeah. I think that's what's interesting with that question. Like, what does sustainable packaging mean to you? And all these words come up, but if we really think about it, like, is any packaging sustainable? Technically speaking, like there's waste attached to all of it. So, in general, I think when a company calls themselves sustainable, that's a red flag. Especially if a clothing company is calling themselves sustainable, like please just proceed with caution when you see that. in terms of the terms there, definitely, I think there's ways in which people are kind of leveraging what they're doing in order to generate sales. And there's nothing per se wrong with that, but it shouldn't necessarily be the main driver. So a great example, I think, is like with these beverage bottles, they're actually only made of like 20%. The Dasani green bottle, or I forget what they call it. It's only made of 20% post-consumer waste, but they're like, oh, the post-consumer waste bottle. And it's not the case. So in general, when we work with brands on sustainability, I'd say it's actually not that creative when we work on their messaging, because the main thing we drive our clients to say is like, hey, we can do better. We're working on doing better. Here's our plans to do better. But in terms of actually labeling or kind of using these as market levers, it's questionable how ethical it is, because at the end of the day, can we say that packaging is sustainable? Probably not. But if there's a specific word that like you've been working on or thinking about, I'm happy to talk about that too.
I think like the compostable one is a big thing, because sometimes people like, there's different routes, and I think people aren't necessarily like, they don't know this.
Yeah, absolutely. That coffee cup example of, it says I'm compostable, but not everyone knows what industrial compost means. And if you go put that in your garden, you're gonna go find it 50 years later, right? So it's like, I think transparency there's a reason why we're seeing it as a driver, but it's just so important, and to be realistic. And that's what we urge our clients to do, is just like, be honest about where you are and be honest about the fact that you can do better, because in reality, there's very few companies that are doing this. And something we actually talk about in building brands a lot is it almost has to be your central strategy. It has to be the reason why the brand exists, but a lot of people kind of want to tack it on. And that's challenging. So if you have a brand you're working with that's their central business strategy, you might have more reasons that are ethical to push and pull those levers. But if it's not a central business strategy, I would be careful.
Just like following up on that, I think it's really interesting when you say that it's questionably ethical to speak to it. How would you feel about like, so many of these DTC brands have such a strong consumer base who really, all of these statistics that are coming out, like people are really conscious of sustainability now, or trying to hold brands accountable. If you have a consumer base that holds your brand accountable, who really calls things out when they think it's not sustainable, but you as a designer or as someone who works with materials knows, like, let's say the plastic versus glass, for example, like, that like, or air freight versus water freight, I guess that's not high and visible. But yeah, plastic versus glass, we made the plastic choice, it's lighter, it's gonna ultimately be better for X, Y, and Z reasons. How do you feel about communicating those things when the consumer is pressing on that side? Because I think it's a really interesting balance, and I would agree that maybe it's not ethical to claim shout sustainability from the rooftops if it's not like your central tenant. But when we're living now in a world where people are expecting it of you and are speaking to it, when do you think it's okay to respond and like speak to it on like the level that we're having this conversation right now? Because I read things and I'm like, oh, well, I can see why they would make this choice. But like, I don't know, it's like an interesting conversation.
That's a hard one to answer, but I would say that, like, as much as it might feel like a buzzword in branding, transparency and sustainability have to go hand in hand. And I think customers really appreciate it. I actually, as much as we might be like fatigued by the like infinite scroll or walls of TikTok, I think it's really interesting that like suddenly like my mom understands what's wrong with fast fashion in a way that like she doesn't shop those brands, but she's aware of it, and information is spreading more. And I think there is a certain like documentary style type thing happening in that world that's exciting, and that is transparency. So I do think brands can leverage social media in order to do that. You have to have leadership on the right side to say like, well, do I want someone in that factory? And the answer is usually no. Most of them do not want to show it. They don't want any kind of inclination there. And you can kind of understand how a business doesn't want to position itself with another business that's not theirs. If we like really practice empathy in that, like they're not that factory and they're just one component of that. But I do think transparency practices in sustainability communication are great. And customers typically do want to learn so long as we give it to them in a format that, I don't know, appeals to the algorithm.
I think a difficult thing with that, I think a lot of companies do go deep into transparency and explain. But it kind of puts you, when your goal is to educate, it like puts you on the defensive. And I think a lot of people try to stay away from that. Cause you will find like with Snapple's change, they had like a whole thing explaining it. And a big recent one was like Lego came out and was like, hey, all transparently, our like recycled brick project isn't working. And they got like a lot of flack, but it was actually like pretty honest of them as a team to say like, cause they came out with a whole report of like, here's what we tried. Here's why it doesn't work. It's just more sustainable to like use virgin material than the work we have to do to make this reuse, but we're like gonna try some new things. And I appreciate that as like someone who reads it, but a lot of people quickly are like, Lego gave up, they've been lying to us for years, and that's that. And I think it's a hard, like, you'll never satisfy everyone. And to the point we made earlier of like that balance is like, some people will still never think Snapple made the right decision and be like, that plastic bottle can end up in the ocean and that's terrible. But the glass one is less sustainable, but if it ends up in the ocean, it's not as bad. So it always is like, it depends what side you want to get mad about. I would say there's
Yeah.
always a side.
There's something to get mad about. There's a great case study I saw that I love that was from Nespresso. And so as we talked about, aluminum is like infinitely recyclable. And they wanted to improve their customer base in New York City, but their capsules would have to be like mailed home. And they were like, well, that's a customer base that just doesn't have time for that. So they put a couple $1 million into New York City's recycling systems to be able to capture their pods. And then they didn't advertise it. They just started saying, hey, New Yorkers, these are recyclable. They didn't say we fixed the recycling stream, that we funded that. And I think that's like a really great way that a brand is actually like taking that initiative, but also maybe being like really careful about the ethics of greenwashing and what they're doing there.
And then on top of that, they still provide you free bags so that you can send the capsules back. And if you choose to do that, they actually tell you what's going to be made out of that. And one of the things is a bicycle, which is amazing because it's like an additional layer of being green and producing something that helps like facilitate the entire thing like further. So yeah, just
I mean, not to get political on it, but I do think brands should be responsible for the waste they produce. Like whether the customer buys it or not, it now exists in our world. It's here. It's like, it's done. And it's not really necessarily the right mode of thinking that we're putting it on the end consumer to dispose of. That's why it's exciting that some of that regulation is changing. But brands like Nespresso saying, okay, well, we have this customer base that's really important to us and we can better serve them by fixing their recycling. And for these other people, we're going to provide these bags and make this part of our service. That's them taking ownership of that waste versus like say Keurig, which is not. And that's simply at a brand level. And I think that's just that mode of thinking is more inspiring than us all being responsible for it at the point of sale.
I just want to make a comment more as a consumer than designer that this was super enlightening for me. We have a lot of discussions on what's really happening in terms of recycling and so I think we're very much group fits together. And also as a creative, it's really inspiring to see all the hard work that goes into like the design process and also the design of the business.
Thank you.
Question? There's one question in the chat. I think I was a really nice note on that one. This question is pretty hyper specific. The question is, can you talk about the cutting edge of eco-friendly communities applied to paperboard/corrugated liners? The question you want to speak to now, or I can also like.
I can quickly, because that's actually my company like
Yeah.
works on that material. I don't. Yes,
Yeah.
I don't think it's mass market yet, but I think you're referring to when you've got like paper cups and they have a plastic lining inside. So even though they're paper, they're not really recyclable because it's a polyethylene lining. I know there are companies, and ours is one of them, and we're working closely with like Dart, who makes like Dart and like Solo Cup stuff, to make like washable off barrier layers, because the problem is like paper will still disintegrate, and I'm so tired of hearing like my parents tell me that paper straws are annoying to them. So that's why they're annoying, is because they don't have a plastic lining. So there are upcoming innovations to make those plastic linings something that won't get in the way of recyclability. But I don't think they're like mass market yet. And I think they're probably starting at like a pretty big level. So like Dart and Solo Cups. But hopefully they are more mass market sooner than later.
Well, if that's all the questions. Yeah,
Yeah, I think so.
okay.
Sure.
Are we-
It seems like this group is like, you know, pretty on the ground with the tools when it comes to stuff, and so if anyone is interested, if anyone's in town, this is the day before Thanksgiving, we're actually doing a tour of, the recycling facility that they were talking about in Sunset Park. It's Wednesday, the 22nd, you can sign up on our website, if somebody signed up for this, and you get to like see what it looks like in there, which I've always been really curious about. So yeah, reach out, stay in touch.
So, yeah, well, thank you all for being here. Thank you, Ellie, for hosting us.
Thank you to everyone on Zoom. We appreciate you.
We'll be around if you want to ask anything or scan some plastic or see what your shirt is made out of,
Yeah,
or see your skin hydration.
yeah, this device can tell you how hydrated your skin is, which is incredible. I want to test it on the straw.
We'll see if it's too black to test. Here, let's see.
Well,
It is too black to test. Yeah.
yeah. Is it? Oh, are you celebrating tonight?
It's always tough, to be honest, like, what I do is like, I would like stuff it inside the cup and hope it makes its way with the cup, or just throw it in the garbage.
I just. Oh, hi, Ty.
We should catch up soon. This is amazing.
Awesome.
And
I love.
I didn't think, so are you guys working together? That's incredible. That's so fun.
I'm surprised I didn't bring it up today, but I'm like, that is a great like consumer change.
Thanks for meeting in person. Actually interviewed with you a few years back. Love your studio. So I recognized you when you talked about the bicycle. I was like, wait, I didn't see it.
But it's been like 2 years.
Yeah.
So it's been a while, but
Yeah, it's really nice. Well, it's nice to connect.